Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I'd been working as a night auditor at the Cedarwood Inn just outside Bozeman, Montana for almost 4 years before the thing with room 218 happened, and even now, almost 6 years later, I can't drive past that property without feeling my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I was 29 at the time, saving up for paramedic school, and the overnight shift suited me because I had quiet hours to study between guests checking in. The Cedarwood was one of those 2-story roadside motels off Highway 191, the kind with exterior doors that opened straight onto the parking lot, a flickering neon sign with a cartoon pine tree, and a vending machine in the breezeway that ate quarters more often than it gave you a soda. We had maybe 30 rooms total, mostly truckers, fishermen, and the occasional family on a budget road trip. My boss Carol owned the place, along with her husband Doug, and they trusted me with everything because I'd never given them a reason not to. The shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and most nights I'd see maybe 1 or 2 walk-ins after midnight. Finish my paperwork by 2 and study until the sun came up. The lobby had this old grandfather clock that Carol had inherited from her father, and the sound of that pendulum became the soundtrack to most of my nights. It was a Tuesday in late September when a man walked into the lobby just after 1 in the morning, and from the second the bell above the door jingled, something felt off. He was tall, probably 6'3", wearing a heavy canvas work coat even though it was warmer outside than usual for that time of year. His hair was dark and combed back, slightly wet-looking, and he had a small overnight bag in one hand and a styrofoam cooler in the other. The cooler was what caught my attention first, because it had duct tape wrapped around the lid in 3 places, like someone really didn't want it coming open. He paid in cash, $89, and when I asked for his ID, he pulled out a Wyoming driver's license that said his name was Eli Marsden. The photo matched, but his eyes in the photo looked friendly, smiling almost, and the eyes looking at me across the counter looked like 2 whetstones. I gave him the key card to room 218 because that's the room our system assigned him, and as he walked out through the breezeway, I noticed he was carrying that cooler the way you'd carry something fragile, both hands cradled underneath, even though it had a handle on top. About an hour later, around 2:15 in the morning, I heard the first thump. The lobby shares a wall with rooms 116 and 117 on the ground floor, but room 218 was directly above 117, and the way the building was constructed, you could sometimes hear footsteps from the second floor if you were sitting at the front desk. The thump wasn't footsteps. It was heavier, more concentrated, like someone had dropped something solid onto the floor. I waited, listened, and a few minutes later there was another one, then another, then a long stretch of silence. I told myself he was just rearranging furniture, or maybe doing push-ups, and I went back to my textbook. Around 3 in the morning, the phone at the front desk rang, and when I picked it up, it was the woman in room 117, Mrs. Patterson, who checked in earlier that evening with her husband on their way to Yellowstone. She was whispering, and she said the people above them were dragging something across the floor, back and forth, over and over, and could I please ask them to stop? I told her I'd take care of it, and I picked up the phone to call room 218. It rang 12 times, and nobody answered. I tried again, and on the second try, someone picked up but didn't say anything. I could hear breathing on the other end, slow and even, and behind that breathing, I could hear what sounded like plastic crinkling. I introduced myself, said I was the night auditor, mentioned a noise complaint, and asked if everything was okay. There was a long pause, and then the man's voice said, "Everything is fine," in a tone so flat it didn't sound like a person talking. It sounded like someone reading the words off a card. He hung up before I could say anything else. The dragging stopped. I sat at my desk, staring at the phone for probably 5 minutes, and then I called Carol at home. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding annoyed but not surprised, because guests had complained about each other before. She told me to send Doug a text and have him drive over if I felt unsafe, but otherwise to just monitor the situation. I texted Doug, who lived about 15 minutes away, and he wrote back saying he'd come by in the morning before his shift if it kept up. I went back to studying, but I couldn't concentrate because the kind of silence that came from room 218 after that phone call wasn't a normal silence. It was the kind of silence where you can feel someone listening on the other side of it. At 4:18 in the morning, the door to room 218 opened. I saw it on the security monitor at the front desk, the grainy black and white image of the second floor breezeway, and Eli Marsden stepped out without his coat, just a dark t-shirt and jeans, and he was carrying that cooler again. The duct tape was still on it. He walked down the exterior staircase to the parking lot, opened the trunk of an older Buick sedan, set the cooler inside very gently, and then went back upstairs and closed his door. He was outside for maybe 90 seconds total, and during that 90 seconds, he never looked toward the lobby once, not even a glance, which is unusual because most people instinctively check their surroundings when they're outside in a parking lot at 4 in the morning. About 20 minutes after that, the dragging started again. This time it was louder, and Mrs. Patterson called a second time, and now her husband was on the line too, and he was angry, and he wanted me to do something. I told him I was going up there personally, and I grabbed the master key card and the heavy mag flashlight Carol kept under the desk, and I walked across the parking lot toward the staircase. The night was cold, my breath fogging in front of me, and the only sound was that vending machine humming in the breezeway. I climbed the stairs slowly, and when I got to the door of 218, I could hear something on the other side, a rhythmic scraping sound, like a knife being sharpened against a stone, but slower and wetter. I knocked. The scraping stopped. I knocked again, identified myself, and asked Mr. Marsden to open the door. There was a pause, and then I heard footsteps coming toward the door, and the door opened maybe 4 inches, with the chain still latched. His face filled that gap, and the first thing I noticed was that he was sweating. Even though the room behind him was so cold, I could feel the air leaking out into the breezeway. He turned the AC down to its lowest setting, and the room smelled like bleach, so strong it made my eyes water. He smiled at me, and his teeth looked too clean, like he'd just brushed them. I told him about the noise, and he apologized, said he'd been doing some stretches for his back. The whole time he was talking, his right hand was behind the door, and I couldn't see what he was holding. I asked him if everything was all right, and he said yes, of course, why wouldn't it be? And there was something in the way he said it that made me feel like I was being measured. I told him to keep the noise down, and I walked back to the lobby, with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingers. As soon as I sat down behind the desk, I called the non-emergency police line. I described what I'd seen, the cooler, the bleach smell, the dragging, the way he held his hand behind the door. The dispatcher said she'd send a deputy to do a welfare check on the room, and one showed up about 35 minutes later, a guy named Deputy Hollis, who I'd seen come into the lobby once or twice before for free coffee. He listened to everything I said, looked at the security footage of Marsden going to his car, and then he and another deputy went up to room 218 together. They knocked for almost 2 minutes before Marsden opened the door, and this time he opened it all the way. They were inside for maybe 7 minutes. When they came out, Deputy Hollis came down to the lobby, and his face had changed. He told me to lock the front door, not let any other guests in or out, and stay behind the counter. He went out to the parking lot with the other deputy, and they popped the trunk of the Buick. I couldn't see what was inside from where I was sitting, but I saw Hollis's shoulders go rigid, and I saw him reach for his radio. Within 25 minutes, there were 6 patrol cars, an ambulance, and a vehicle from the Sheriff's Department crime scene unit in our parking lot. They evacuated rooms 117 and 119, and they wouldn't let anyone leave the property. They arrested Eli Marsden, walked him out in handcuffs, and he stared straight ahead the entire time, didn't say a word, didn't even seem to register that anything was happening. The cooler in the trunk had body parts in it. They weren't human. That's what I want everyone to understand right up front, because for about 36 hours, I genuinely believed I'd just helped catch a murderer. What was actually in the cooler, what they confirmed at the lab a few days later, was the partially butchered remains of a yearling black bear cub, along with several smaller animals, a bobcat kitten and 2 marmots, all of them killed and processed in a way that the wildlife officer described as ritualistic. Marsden had been a long-haul driver who'd lost his commercial license 3 years earlier, and he'd been moving from motel to motel across 5 states for the past 8 months, and the troopers found photographs in his room, in a binder he'd been carrying in his overnight bag, of dozens of animals he'd killed in similar ways, along with hand-drawn maps of motels and rest stops, including ours, including a circled notation next to room 218 that said quiet, ground floor neighbors only. The dragging Mrs. Patterson had heard was him cleaning up. The bleach was for the bathtub. Some of the photographs had children's toys in the background, and that's what the investigators couldn't get past, because while there was no evidence he'd ever harmed a person, the toys were arranged, deliberate, and in some of the photographs you could see a child's shoe in the corner of the frame, a real one, the kind a kid had actually worn. They never found the children those toys belonged to, if there even were any. Marsden was charged with 14 counts of wildlife violations and 1 count of cruelty to animals, and he served 22 months. He was released in 2022. Carroll sold the Cedarwood about a year after the incident, and the new owners renumbered all the rooms, but the building is still there, and 218 is now called 222, and sometimes when I drive by on my way home from my paramedic shifts, I see a light on in that window at 4 in the morning, and I think about the way he smiled at me through the chain. The summer I turned 17, my older cousin Beck convinced me to come up to his cabin on Lake Vermilion in northern Minnesota for 2 weeks, and the things I saw on that lake have kept me from ever owning waterfront property as an adult. Beck was 24 at the time, had inherited the cabin from our grandfather, and was using it mostly as a place to escape his life back in Minneapolis after a bad breakup. The cabin itself was small, 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a screened porch that wrapped around 3 sides, and it sat at the end of a half-mile dirt driveway that branched off a county road that nobody but locals ever used. The nearest neighbor was a couple named the Halversons, about a quarter mile through the woods, and beyond them there was nothing for another 2 miles. The lake was beautiful, dark blue, fed by springs, surrounded by white pine and birch, and at night the loons would coal across the water in a way that made the whole world feel ancient. Beck had a 16-foot aluminum fishing boat with a small outboard, and we'd spend most days drifting around the bay, catching walleye, drinking sodas, and not talking much, which was fine with both of us. The first week was uneventful. We caught fish. We read books on the porch. Beck taught me how to split firewood properly, and I started to understand why our grandfather had loved the place so much. The trouble started on a Sunday evening, the beginning of the 2nd week, when Beck and I were sitting on the dock watching the sunset, and we noticed a pontoon boat drifting in the middle of the bay about 200 yards out. There was nothing unusual about a pontoon boat on Lake Vermilion, but there was something unusual about this one, because it didn't seem to have anyone on it. The motor wasn't running. There was no fishing line in the water. It was just sitting there, slowly turning in the breeze. Beck watched it through the binoculars he kept on the dock for bird watching, and after a few minutes he handed them to me, and I could see clearly that there were 4 lawn chairs set up on the deck of the pontoon, all of them empty, and a cooler, and what looked like a portable stereo, but no people. We watched it for almost an hour as the sun went down, and at no point did anyone come up from the cabin area of the boat. Eventually it drifted toward the far shore, and we lost sight of it as the light failed. Beck mentioned it to the Halversons the next morning when he stopped by to drop off some extra fish, and Mr. Halverson, who'd lived on the lake for 30 years, said he hadn't seen it, but that sometimes people went swimming and let their boats drift. Beck didn't argue, but on the drive back to our cabin, he told me he didn't think anyone had been swimming. He said the way the boat was just sitting there felt staged, like a prop. That night, around 11 in the evening, I was on the porch, reading by the light of an oil lamp, when I heard a motor on the lake. I looked up and saw running lights moving slowly along our shoreline, maybe 50 yards out. Boats on the lake at night weren't unusual either. Sometimes people went night fishing, but this one was moving in a strange pattern, slow and zigzagging, and after a minute it stopped almost directly in front of our dock, the engine cutting off, and I could see the silhouette of the pontoon boat from earlier sitting there in the moonlight. I called Beck out onto the porch quietly, and we both watched it for maybe 20 minutes. There was no movement on the boat, no voices, no fishing, nothing, just the boat sitting there, facing our cabin. Eventually Beck went inside and got the rifle our grandfather had left in the closet, an old .30-30, and he loaded it and set it on the porch table. He didn't point it at the boat or anything, he just wanted it accessible. About 30 minutes after we'd first noticed it, the engine started up again, and the pontoon moved slowly off down the shoreline and disappeared around the point. We didn't sleep much that night. The next day, Beck drove into town and stopped by the sheriff's office, where he told a deputy named Linda what had happened. Linda apparently knew Beck a little, because she'd gone to high school with his older sister, and she took the report seriously enough to write it down. But she also told him that there'd been a few incidents on the lake that summer, and that some of the property crimes had involved people scoping out cabins from the water before breaking in during the off-season. She said to keep the doors locked and call dispatch immediately if the boat came back. That afternoon, Beck and I drove around to several public boat launches looking for the pontoon, and we found it tied up at a launch on the south side of the lake. It was a rental from a marina about 20 minutes away, and the lawn chairs were still on the deck, and the cooler, and the stereo, but nobody was around. Beck wrote down the registration number, and we drove to the marina, where the owner, a guy named Dale, told us the boat had been rented for the entire 2 weeks by a man who'd paid in cash and given a name and address that, when Dale checked later at our request, turned out to be fake. Dale said the renter had been a quiet guy in his 50s, average height, average build, no distinguishing features, and that he'd seemed normal at first, but had asked unusual questions about which parts of the lake had the fewest cabins and which areas weren't visible from the main channel. Dale hadn't thought much of it, because some renters wanted privacy. We told Dale about the deputy, and Dale called her right then, and Linda came out to the marina to take photos of the pontoon and look through it. She didn't find anything illegal, but in one of the storage compartments under a seat, she found a roll of duct tape, a hunting knife, a pair of black gloves, and a cheap pay-as-you-go cell phone. Nothing about that was illegal either, but Linda's expression got tighter as she looked at it. She told Beck and me to go back to the cabin, lock everything up, and not go out on the lake until she called. That night, around 2 in the morning, we heard footsteps on the porch, not the gentle creak of an animal, but slow, deliberate human footsteps, walking the perimeter of the cabin. Beck grabbed the rifle, and I grabbed a flashlight, and we moved to the front door together. Beck called out, identified himself, said he was armed, and the footsteps stopped. We waited, barely breathing, and after maybe a minute, we heard them again, moving away, off the porch, and down toward the lake. I looked out the porch window and saw a figure, a man, walking down our dock toward the water, and there was a small boat tied up at the end of it that hadn't been there before, a rowboat, dark, low to the water. He climbed into it and rowed slowly away, and we couldn't see him after about 30 yards because he was using muffled oars and there was no moon. Beck called the sheriff, and Linda came out herself, lights off until she got to our driveway, and she searched the property with another deputy. They found boot prints in the soft ground around the cabin, size 11, and they found that someone had cut a small notch into the door frame at the back door, the kind of notch you'd make if you were planning to come back and pry the door open later. They also found a small pile of cigarette butts in the woods, about 30 feet from the porch, where someone had been sitting and watching the cabin, possibly for hours. Beck and I packed up that morning. We didn't even finish the second week. As we were loading the car, Mr. Heverson came over, and Beck told him what had happened. Mr. Heverson went pale, and he told us that 6 weeks earlier, A couple from Wisconsin who were renting a cabin on the next bay had been tied up and robbed in the middle of the night by two men who'd come in from the lake in a small boat. The couple had survived, but it had taken them 4 hours to free themselves after the men left, and the men had taken everything, including the woman's wedding ring, which she'd had to give them after one of them held a knife against her throat. The investigation had stalled because the men had left no evidence beyond boot prints, and nobody had connected the pontoon rentals to the case until Linda started looking that week. They never caught the men. The pontoon was never rented under that fake name again, and the marina started requiring photo ID after that summer, and the sheriff's department put out alerts to all the marina owners on the lake. Beck sold the cabin the following spring. He told me he just couldn't sleep there anymore, and I understood. Sometimes I see ads for cabin rentals on lakes in the upper Midwest, and I think about that pontoon drifting in the bay, those 4 empty lawn chairs, the cooler that nobody was eating from, and I close the browser tab. In 2019, I was working as a home health nurse in a rural part of eastern Kentucky, and I had a patient who lived so far back in the hollers that you couldn't reach her house in the winter without a 4-wheel drive truck. Her name was Nellie. She was 84 years old. She had end-stage congestive heart failure, and she lived alone in a 2-room cabin that her husband had built in 1962. Her son Roy lived about a mile down the road in a double-wide, and he checked on her every evening, but during the day she was usually by herself, and my job was to drive out 3 times a week to check her vitals, change her wound dressings, and make sure she was taking her medications properly. I'd been seeing Nellie for about 8 months when the events I want to describe started happening, and I want to say up front that Nellie was sharp as a tack, no dementia, no confusion, and the things she told me she was experiencing were not the result of an aging mind. They started with the dog. Nellie had an old beagle named Buster, who'd been her constant companion for 11 years, and one Tuesday in February, when I came to do my visit, Nellie told me that Buster had been acting strange for about a week. He wouldn't go outside after dark anymore. He was sleeping under her bed instead of in his usual spot by the wood stove, and he kept growling at the front window even when nothing was visible outside. I asked Nellie if she'd seen anything herself, and she said yes. She'd seen lights in the woods behind her property 3 nights in a row, moving lights, the kind a person would carry, and she'd called Roy about it, but Roy had gone out and looked and hadn't found anything. I made a note of it, but I didn't think too much of it, because there were hunters all over those woods, and people walked their property lines at all hours. The next time I came out, on Friday, Nellie was upset. She told me that the night before, around 3 in the morning, someone had knocked on her front door. 3 slow knocks. She'd called out asking who it was, and there'd been no answer. She'd gotten up, gone to the door with her shotgun, and looked out through the small window beside the frame, and there'd been nobody there. Buster had been growling the whole time, his hackles up, staring at the door. Nellie had called Roy, but Roy hadn't been able to come because his truck was broken down, and by the time he'd walked the mile up the holler with a flashlight, whoever had knocked was long gone. There were no footprints in the frost on her porch, which Nellie said was the strangest part, because there should have been. I told Nellie I'd mention it to Roy when I left, and I did, and Roy was already worried. He told me he'd been sleeping on her couch the past 2 nights, and that he'd heard things himself, footsteps in the gravel of her driveway, but every time he'd gone out to look, there'd been nothing. He thought maybe it was the Wallens, a family who lived about 3 miles deeper in the holler, who'd had a long-running feud with Nellie's late husband over a piece of property, but the Wallens were mostly old now too, and Roy didn't really think they were behind it. He just couldn't think of any other explanation. The week after that, Nellie's medications started disappearing. She kept them in a plastic organizer on her kitchen table, the kind with little compartments for each day, and one morning she woke up, and Wednesday's compartment was empty, when it shouldn't have been. She thought maybe she'd taken them by accident in the middle of the night, but Nellie was meticulous about her medications, and she kept a written log, and she hadn't taken them. 2 days later, Friday's compartment was empty too. Roy installed a chain lock on the front door and a stick in the track of the back door, and he started staying every night. and the disappearances stopped, but other things didn't. Nellie's dishes were being moved around in her cabinets. Her photographs on the mantel would be slightly turned, facing different directions, every morning when she woke up. Buster wouldn't even come out from under the bed during the day anymore. I was getting genuinely scared for her, and I called my supervisor at the agency, who told me she'd contact the sheriff's department and that she was going to put a note in Nellie's chart that she might need to be moved to a facility temporarily. That Sunday night, at around 1 a.m, Roy woke up on the couch to the sound of Nellie screaming. He grabbed the shotgun and ran to her bedroom, and what he saw in there was a man, a stranger, kneeling beside Nellie's bed, holding her hand. The man was in his 40s, dirty, wearing a heavy coat that smelled like wood smoke, and when Roy pointed the gun at him, the man didn't run. He just slowly let go of Nellie's hand and stood up, and he said, in a perfectly calm voice, "Mama, I came home." Roy held him there at gunpoint, while Nellie called 911 from the phone by her bed, and the deputies arrived 25 minutes later. The man didn't fight when they handcuffed him, didn't say anything else, just kept staring at Nellie with this look of love and grief on his face. They took him in, and the next day the sheriff came out to the cabin to talk to Roy and Nellie about what they'd found. The man's name was Carl Tibbs. He was 47 years old. He'd been living in the woods behind Nellie's property for at least 6 weeks, in a small camp he'd built about 200 yards from her cabin, hidden in a stand of cedar trees. The camp had a tarp shelter, a small fire pit, a sleeping bag, and a backpack full of stolen food, including, the deputies confirmed, Nellie's missing medications. He'd been entering her cabin at night through a window in the small room behind the kitchen that didn't lock properly, the one Nellie used for storage and never went into. He'd been doing it for weeks. Sometimes he'd just sit in her kitchen, at the table, in the dark. Sometimes he'd open her cabinets. Once he'd gone into her bedroom and sat in the chair across from her bed and watched her sleep for, by his own admission later, almost an hour. He'd never harmed her. He'd never touched her until that last night when he'd taken her hand. The sheriff told Roy and Nellie that Carl had a history of severe mental illness, that he'd been in and out of state hospitals for 25 years, and that he'd recently been released from one in Lexington and had stopped taking his medications. He'd grown up about 40 miles away. His own mother had died in 1998. He'd seen Nellie at the gas station in town one day in late December, and something about her had reminded him of his mother, and he'd followed her home, and he'd just stayed. He told the deputies that he'd been planning to take care of her, that he was going to fix her roof when the weather got warmer, that he loved her. The court eventually ruled him incompetent to stand trial and committed him to a forensic psychiatric facility, where he is still, as far as I know. Nellie moved in with Roy after that. She lived another 18 months. She told me, in one of my last visits with her at Roy's Double-Wide, that she wasn't angry at Carl. She said she felt sorry for him. She said the thing that had really frightened her, the thing she couldn't get past, wasn't that he'd been in her house. It was that for weeks she'd known something was wrong, and nobody had been able to find anything, and she'd started to doubt her own mind, and that doubt had been worse than the fear. She said the lesson she'd learned, and the one she wanted me to remember, was that when something feels wrong, even if you can't prove it, even if no one else believes you, you should never stop saying so out loud. She squeezed my hand when she said it, and her grip was still surprisingly strong. The thing that happened to my sister Marin in 2017 has changed our entire family, and even now, my parents won't talk about it at the dinner table, won't even let her name come up unless she brings it up first. Marin was 22 then, just out of college, working a temp job at an advertising agency in Chicago, and renting a small studio apartment in a converted brownstone in the Edgewater neighborhood. The building had 6 units total, 3 on each floor, and Marin's apartment was on the second floor at the back, with a window that overlooked a narrow gangway between her building and the next one over. The gangway was maybe 8 feet wide, full of trash cans and the kind of overgrown weeds that grow in the alleys of older Chicago neighborhoods, and Marin's window was about 12 feet up from the ground. She'd been living there about 4 months when she started feeling like someone was watching her. It started small. She'd come home from work and feel like things in her apartment had been moved an inch or two in one direction. Her toothbrush would be on the wrong side of the cup. The throw pillow on her couch would be flipped over. She thought she was being paranoid, the kind of paranoid that single women in big cities sometimes feel when they're living alone for the first time. And she didn't tell anyone because she didn't want my mother to worry. Then she started noticing the smell. It was faint, only sometimes, and it was concentrated near her bathroom, a smell like cigarette smoke, even though Marin didn't smoke and none of her neighbors smoked. She mentioned it to her landlord, a man named Mr. Petros, who lived in the basement unit, and he told her it was probably coming through the vents from the alley, and that homeless people sometimes slept back there in the warmer months. Marin accepted that explanation and tried to forget about it. The first time she actually saw something was on a Saturday afternoon in late June. She was sitting on her couch reading, and she happened to glance toward her bathroom, and she saw, very briefly, what she thought was a shadow move across the gap under the bathroom door. She froze. She listened. She didn't hear anything. She got up slowly, walked to the bathroom, and pushed the door open, and the bathroom was empty. The window was closed. The medicine cabinet was closed. Everything looked normal, but the cigarette smell was stronger than usual. She told her best friend Hannah about it that night over the phone, and Hannah told her to call the police, but Marin felt embarrassed about calling the police over a shadow and a smell, so she didn't. She did, however, go to a hardware store the next day and buy a small wedge that she could shove under her front door from the inside at night, and she started double-checking her windows. The next week, the day she came home from work and found her bedroom closet door open when she was certain she'd closed it that morning, she finally called my parents. My father drove up from Indiana that weekend with a contractor friend of his, and they did a complete walk-through of her apartment, and they found something that nobody had noticed before. In the back of her bedroom closet, behind a hanging garment bag, there was a small access panel in the wall, maybe 18 inches square, that led to a utility space between her apartment and the one next door. The panel had been painted over multiple times, and the seam was nearly invisible, but when my father pulled on it, it came open. Inside the utility space, which ran the entire vertical height of the building, was a kind of crawl space. The space had clearly been used by someone. There was a sleeping bag, an empty water bottle, a pile of cigarette butts, and a small stack of women's magazines, the kind Marin read that had her address label on them, magazines she'd thrown away weeks earlier. There was also a collection of items that had belonged to her, small things she hadn't even realized were missing, a hairbrush, a pair of earrings, a single sock, and a photograph of her and Hannah from a beach trip they'd taken the previous summer. My father called the police immediately. The detective who came out, a woman named Detective Amaya, climbed up into the access space herself, and she found something the rest of us hadn't seen. From inside the crawl space, you could see directly into Marin's apartment through 3 separate locations. There was a small hole, the size of a pencil, drilled through the wall of her closet, positioned so that someone in the crawl space could look out into her bedroom. There was a similar hole in the wall behind her bathroom mirror, where the silvering on the back of the mirror had been carefully scraped away in a small spot to create a one-way view. And there was a third hole in the kitchen, behind the refrigerator, looking into a living room. Whoever had been in that crawl space had been able to watch every part of her apartment except the front entryway. The detective brought in a forensics team, and they found fingerprints, and they found DNA, and within 36 hours they had a name, because the prints matched a man named Aaron Pelleter, who had been arrested 8 years earlier in Wisconsin for a similar crime, where he'd hidden in the attic of a house owned by a woman who'd been his co-worker. He'd served 4 years for that, gotten out, moved to Illinois, and he was currently working as a building maintenance contractor for a company that had done some work on Marin's brownstone the previous fall. He'd been the one who'd painted over the access panel. He'd been the one who'd known it was there. They arrested him at his apartment in Rogers Park 2 days later. He had a notebook in his nightstand with detailed observations about Murren's daily routine, what time she came home, what time she showered, what time she went to bed, what she ate for breakfast. He'd been in that crawl space, the police estimated, at least 30 separate times over a 3-month period. He'd been there sometimes for 6 or 7 hours at a stretch. When Murren was at work, he'd been in her actual apartment, going through her things. The detective told my parents that Aaron Pelletier had probably been planning to escalate, that he had been in the patient, watching phase of a pattern that in similar cases had ended badly. They couldn't prove what he was going to do, only what he had already done, which was enough to put him away for 12 years on burglary, voyeurism, and stalking charges. Maren moved out the next day. She lived with my parents for about a year before she felt safe living alone again. She still won't have a closet in her bedroom. Her current apartment has a wardrobe, a freestanding one, that she can pull away from the wall anytime she wants to check behind it. She told me once that what scared her most, even more than knowing he'd been in her apartment, was knowing that for 3 months she'd been right. Her instincts had been right. Things had been moving in her apartment. Someone had been there, and she talked herself out of believing it because it sounded crazy. She said she'll never doubt her gut again, no matter how crazy it sounds. The last story I'll tell you tonight took place when I was 19, working a summer job as a wildland firefighter in eastern Oregon on a hand crew based out of a small ranger station near the town of John Day. There were 18 of us on the crew, mostly young guys in their early 20s, a few older sawyers, and our crew boss, a man named Ruben, who'd been doing the job for almost 30 years. The summer of 2014 was a bad fire season. We were on the line constantly, working 14-day rotations on remote fires, sleeping in spike camps, eating MREs, and going days without showers. The fire I want to tell you about was called the Buck Hollow Fire, and it was burning in a stretch of high desert and ponderosa pine forest, about 40 miles from the nearest paved road. We'd been on it for 8 days, and the fire had been mostly contained on 3 sides, but the 4th side, the north flank, was still active, running through some steep, rocky terrain that the bulldozers couldn't reach. Our crew had been assigned to cut a hand line along the north flank, working in 2 squads, and on the day everything went wrong, my squad of 9 was working a section of line about 2 miles from our spike camp, in country so rough that we had to be flown in by helicopter every morning. The squad leader was a guy named Tomas, a Mexican-American sawyer from Arizona who'd been doing the job for 10 years, and he was as competent and steady as anyone I've ever worked with. The thing that made the Buck Hollow country strange was that it was full of old homesteads. The area had been settled in the 1880s and abandoned by the 1930s, and there were ruins all over the hills, collapsed cabins, the foundations of barns, old mining tools rusting in the dirt. We'd been told by the incident command not to enter any of the structures, both because they might be unstable and because they could be archaeological sites. We mostly ignored the ruins, but you couldn't help noticing them. On day 8, we were cutting line along a ridge that overlooked a small drainage, and at the bottom of the drainage there was a homestead that was in better shape than most of the others. The cabin was still standing. The roof was partially intact. There was a small barn behind it, and what looked like the remains of a corral. We'd been working since 6 in the morning, and around 11 we took our lunch break, sitting on the rocks above the drainage, eating our MREs and looking down at the homestead. One of the new guys on the crew, a kid named Wesley, who was on his first fire, said he wanted to go down and look at the cabin. Tomas told him no. Wesley pushed, said he'd just be 5 minutes, and Tomas told him absolutely not, that the rule was no entering structures, and that was final. Wesley sulked, but he didn't argue further. We finished lunch and went back to work. About an hour later, Tomas radioed me over, and he was holding his binoculars up to his eyes, and he handed them to me without saying anything, and he pointed down at the homestead. I looked. There was smoke coming out of the cabin's chimney. Not a lot, just a thin grey wisp, but it was definitely smoke from a fire someone had built. Tomas got on the radio to crew boss Ruben, who was with the other squad about a mile to the east, and reported it. Ruben told us to stay where we were and continue the line, and he'd notify Incident Command and law enforcement. About 30 minutes later, a helicopter flew over the area, and we watched it circle the homestead twice and then continue on. Ruben radioed us back and said the helicopter pilot had reported nothing unusual, no people visible, but that the smoke was confirmed. The fire had been close enough to that area in the previous week that people sometimes set up illegal camps in the burn perimeter to avoid being detected, and Incident Command was sending a Forest Service law enforcement officer to investigate, but it would take him at least 4 hours to reach the area on foot. We kept working. Around 3 in the afternoon, I was on the saw, cutting through a section of downed timber, and I had my back to the drainage. Tomas was watching me from about 20 feet away as my swamper, the person who keeps the area clear of debris and watches for hazards. I was in the middle of a cut when I saw Thomas's face change, and I shut down the saw and pulled off my ear protection, and Thomas said in a very flat voice, "Don't turn around fast, but I want you to look down at the cabin." I turned slowly. There was a man standing in the doorway of the cabin. He was looking up at us. He was maybe 200 yards away, far enough that I couldn't see his face clearly, but close enough to see that he was a man, that he was wearing dark clothes, and that he was just standing there, motionless, watching us. He raised one hand and waved at us, slow. Tomas didn't wave back. He picked up his radio and called Ruben, and as he was calling, the man stepped back into the cabin and disappeared. Ruben told us to pull back from the line, regroup with the rest of the squad, and head south toward the spike camp. He said the law enforcement officer was still 2 hours out, and that we shouldn't be working that close to a possible suspect. We started gathering our gear. As we were loading up our packs, one of the guys on the crew, a sawyer named Kit, called out to Thomas that he could see something moving in the trees about halfway between us and the cabin. We all stopped and looked. There were 2 figures, then 3, moving up the slope toward us, weaving through the timber. They weren't running, but they weren't being subtle either. They were closing the distance between us at a steady walk. Thomas counted them out loud as more became visible. 4, 5, 6, and then he stopped counting and told us to move. We started hiking south, fast, packs only half on, tools in our hands. The men on the slope behind us picked up their pace. They never ran, but they walked faster, and the distance between us stayed about the same, maybe 150 yards. Thomas was on the radio constantly, narrating our position, our heading, the number of people behind us. Ruben told us to head for a ridge about a mile south, where a helicopter could land if we could reach an open meadow on the backside. We hiked. The terrain was brutal, scree and downed timber and steep grades, and we were already exhausted from a full morning of cutting line, and we were carrying tools. Wesley fell at one point and twisted his ankle, and 2 of us had to help him along, and the men behind us got closer, maybe 100 yards now. They never said anything, they never shouted, they just kept coming. Thomas stopped twice and looked back through his binoculars, and the second time his face went white and he didn't tell us what he saw, he just told us to keep moving. We made it to the meadow about 40 minutes later. The helicopter was already circling. The men behind us had stopped at the tree line. They stood there, 7 of them, and watched as we ran out into the open, and the helicopter set down and we piled in. The pilot, a man named Hicks, lifted us off, and as we rose, I looked down through the open door at the tree line, and the men were gone. The Forest Service law enforcement officer, working with the county sheriff's department, conducted a search of that homestead the next day with 4 deputies and a tracking dog. They found evidence that people had been living there for a long time, possibly years. They found stockpiles of food, of weapons, of supplies. They found a network of camouflaged shelters in the surrounding forest, so well hidden that you could walk past them at 10 feet and not see them. They found a generator, batteries, a satellite phone, and a large quantity of cash in different currencies. What they didn't find were any people. Whoever had been there had cleared out in the few hours between our retreat and the arrival of law enforcement. The case was eventually picked up by federal investigators who told our agency, off the record, that the site appeared to have been used by a small group that was either part of a militia movement or part of a smuggling operation, and possibly both. They believed the group had been using the remote burn areas of the forest as a kind of staging ground, knowing that fire crews and federal personnel only came through the area sporadically and that the public never came at all. They believed that what had happened with us, the man waving from the doorway, the deliberate slow pursuit, had been an attempt to drive us off the ridge before we could see whatever was being moved through the camp that day. Tomas told me later, when we were back at the ranger station, that what he'd seen through the binoculars on his second look, the thing he hadn't told us about while we were hiking, was that 2 of the men behind us had been carrying rifles. They could have shot us if they'd wanted to. They didn't, because shooting us would have brought a much larger response, and they wanted us gone, not dead. He told me he thought about that every time he hiked into a remote area for the rest of the season, and every season after. I quit the next year. I went back to college, finished my degree, became an accountant, which is what I do now, and I've never once regretted choosing the kind of job where the only thing that ever follows me up a mountain is a deadline. But every now and then, when I see a thin wisp of smoke from a chimney somewhere, I remember the way that man waved at us, slow and patient, and I remember the way he stepped back into the cabin without ever looking away, and I think about the 7 figures standing at the tree line as our helicopter rose, and I think about how lucky we were that they decided we weren't worth the trouble. About 6 months after the Buck Hollow fire, in the dead of winter, I got a call from Tomas I still think about when I wake up at 3 in the morning for no reason. I hadn't talked to him since the season ended. He'd gone on to another crew down in Arizona. I'd gone back to school, and I figured the whole thing was just one of those stories you trade over beers and then let fade into the background of your life. He sounded tired on the phone, older than he had any right to at 32. "Hey kid," he said, same way he always did, even though I was 19, not 9. "Got something you should know about. You remember Buck Hollow?" He didn't phrase it like a question. I went cold all over again just hearing the name. I told him, yeah, of course I remembered. He was quiet for a second, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Got a friend in Forest Service law enforcement. She sent me something she shouldn't have. Thought you might want to hear before it ends up on the news, if it ever does." I could hear typing in the background, a distant TV, the clink of a beer bottle hitting a table. He took a breath. "They went back out to that homestead in November," he said, "after the snow. Just a follow-up, they said. Wanted to see if anybody had moved back in. They figured those guys might have left a cache or something. You know how it is. People don't like to abandon good hideouts." He paused again, and I could hear the faint sound of him rubbing his beard against the phone, like he did when he was trying to find the least messed up way to say something. "It was empty," he said. "Cabin, outbuildings, all of it. Looked like nobody had been there for months. No fresh tracks, no smoke, no food, just dust and snow." I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath. "Okay," I said, "so they really did leave. Good, right?" "Yeah," he said, "except for one thing." I heard the click of his laptop closing, as if he didn't want whatever he was about to say anywhere near a screen. "They found a tree," he said, "up on that ridge where we were cutting line, about 50 yards from where we had lunch that day. Big old ponderosa. You might remember it. Lightning scar running down one side." I did remember it. I'd leaned my back against that scar while I ate, feeling the rough, twisted bark through my shirt. "Someone had carved into it," Tomas went on. "Deep, like way past the cambium. Took their time with it. My friend said it looked almost careful, like they didn't want to kill the tree, just mark it." "What did it say?" I asked, even though I already knew I didn't want the answer. He cleared his throat. "It had a date," he said. "The day we were there, the exact date. And under it, one word, pass." The silence that followed felt like a weight. "Pass. Like, what, a grade?" I said, trying to make it a joke and failing miserably. "Pass, like we passed some kind of inspection," he said, her words, not mine. "They had us in binoculars long before we ever saw that guy in the doorway, kid. They were watching us as soon as we topped that ridge, maybe before. They knew how many we had. They knew we were carrying saws, not rifles. They knew we weren't there for them, so they let us go." He lowered his voice. "What keeps me up," he said, "is wondering what the tree looks like for the crews they don't let go." I didn't have anything to say to that. "You ever see that on a fire?" he added. "You walk the other way. I don't care what your division supervisor says. You turn around and you walk away." There was another pause. Then he exhaled. "Anyway," he said, suddenly trying to sound casual, "just thought you'd appreciate knowing you aced your first pop quiz and not getting disappeared in the woods. Congratulations." We both laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that feels good. It was the kind you do when you're trying to shake something off your skin. We hung up, and I sat there in my crappy off-campus apartment, staring at the wall for a long time afterward, because the part that stuck with me wasn't the date on that tree or the word itself. It was the idea that someone had walked up that ridge after we left, stood in the exact spot where we'd eaten lunch, and decided to leave a record. Not a threat, not a warning, a notation, like we were just another part of their paperwork. I still dream about Buck Hollow sometimes. Only in the dreams. The man in the doorway doesn't wave. He just stands there while we cut line, and I know, somehow, that this time we didn't pass. I was 28 when I realized that the worst horror stories aren't about ghosts or monsters. Not really. They're about people. People who learn the rules of whatever world they're in and then start bending them just to see if they can. The folks at Donovan Farm, the ones in that black truck on Highway 50, the man in my patient's house who thought he was her son, the guy in my sister's walls, the tweakers behind the fence, the neighbor watching from across the hole. They all had one thing in common. They didn't think any of this applied to them. Laws, norms, boundaries, those things are real, but they only work as long as everyone more or less agrees to pretend they do. Most people go their whole lives without meeting someone who walked away from that agreement a long time ago. If you're very lucky, you only ever hear about them in stories like this. If you're unlucky, you end up in the story. Sometimes I think about how thin the margin was in every one of these situations. A dispatcher deciding which call to prioritize, a patrol car being 10 miles closer than usual, a landlord who actually bothered to listen, a dog that wouldn't stop growling, a set of headlights that happened to crest a hill at the right moment, a crew boss who trusted his gut enough to pull us off that ridge. You don't notice those margins when nothing happens. You only see them afterward when you realize how many ways it could have gone the other direction. I know there's a temptation, listening to stories like these, to say that you would never let it get that far. You'd move after the first weird knock on the door. You'd call the cops the first time something went missing. You'd trust your instincts immediately, not after months of second guessing. Maybe you would. I hope you would. But I've seen how it really works. You're tired. You're busy. You don't want to look crazy. You don't want to accuse someone who might be innocent. You tell yourself there's a rational explanation, because most of the time there is. And every time you choose not to make a fuss, you move the line of what you'll tolerate just a little bit further out. You don't know you've crossed it until you've already stepped into someone else's game. A few months ago, I was driving home from work just after midnight. I'd stayed late at the office finishing a client file. The roads were wet with a light rain, and I was thinking about nothing in particular. I stopped at a red light downtown, one of those big multi-lane intersections with empty storefronts on 2 corners and a 24-hour gas station on the third. While I was waiting, I glanced up at the second floor of the building to my left and saw a man standing in a window. He was backlit by a fluorescent ceiling fixture, just a dark shape against pale light, but I could tell he was looking straight down at the intersection, not out at the city, not at the horizon, at the crosswalk, at the cars. His hand was pressed against the glass in this weird slow-motion wave, not moving side to side, just lifting up, pressing, lowering again, lift, press, lower, over and over, like he was feeling for something between him and the outside world. The light turned green. I drove through the intersection. I didn't look back. When I got home, I locked my door, checked the closet, checked under the bed, checked the bathroom mirror like I always do now, even though I know there's nothing behind it. And then, sitting in the dark of my small living room, listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of a train, I realized something. All these stories I've told you tonight, all these things that happened to me or to people I know, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end because I survived them, because someone made a decision that pulled the situation back from the edge, because luck, or instinct, or sheer stubbornness kicked in at the right time. Not all stories end like that. There are empty cabins in the woods, and motel rooms with numbers that got changed, and chimneys that don't smoke anymore, and driveways where nobody checks on the old woman at the end of the holler because her porch light burned out and nobody thought it was their business. There are trucks abandoned on the side of desert highways with their engines still warm. There are apartments with access panels nobody has found yet. Those are stories too. You just don't get to hear them. So if you take anything away from what you've heard tonight, let it be this. When something feels wrong, pay attention. When the hair stands up on the back of your neck for no good reason, don't argue with it. When the quiet feels too thick, when the neighbor at your door smiles too wide, when the job offer seems too generous for the risk they're asking you to take, when you hear slow footsteps on your porch at 3 a.m. and no one answers when you call out, believe yourself. Because there are people out there who have spent years learning exactly how far they can push before you'll say something. They count on that hesitation. They live in that hesitation. And to them, you're not a person. You're just a line on a page, a problem to solve, a note carved into a tree that says pass or something else. In the end, the only difference between a scary story you listen to on a screen and one someone tells about you is whether you notice the signs in time to walk away. If you're listening to this right now, it means you still have that chance. Use it, because the truth is, nothing I've told you tonight is special. It didn't happen because I'm cursed, or because the people in these stories were uniquely unlucky. It happened because they lived in the world the way you do, with groceries to carry, and bills to pay, and doors you open without thinking because you opened them yesterday, and nothing bad happened. The horror isn't that these things can happen. The horror is that most of the time, they don't feel like horror until you're already halfway through. Ask my old neighbors in Columbus who thought Diane was just lonely. Ask the guy at the truck stop outside Des Moines who told me about 3 other drivers who never made their deliveries. Ask my cousin Beck, who still wakes up sometimes swearing he hears oars in the dark. Ask my sister, who can't stand the sound of drywall dust anymore because it reminds her of the noise she never quite registered behind her bedroom wall. They'll all tell you the same thing in different words. It didn't feel like a big deal at first. By the time it did, they were already in it. So lock your doors, check your windows, listen when the dog growls at a corner of the room that looks empty to you. Don't loan more money to the neighbor who always seems to have an emergency, no matter how sad her stories are. Don't follow delivery instructions that send you past the last streetlight into a place where the only witnesses are shadows. Don't ever assume that because something is familiar, it's safe. And when that small, stubborn voice in the back of your head says, "This isn't right," don't argue with it. Turn around if you can. Call for help if you can't. Say something out loud so the people around you hear it too. So later, if it all goes sideways, nobody can say they weren't warned, because someone is always keeping notes, whether it's a woman with a ledger full of your weaknesses, a man scratching pass into a tree, or just the world itself, tallying up the times you looked away when you shouldn't have. Tonight, you get to decide which side of that ledger you end up on. You can walk to your door, turn the deadbolt, look once through the peephole, and go to bed knowing you listened. Or you can shrug, tell yourself it's nothing, and let the story keep going without you noticing the chapter break. If you're still here, still listening to my voice in the dark, remember this when you turn off the light. The scariest thing about true horror stories isn't that they happened. It's that somewhere, someone else is living one right now, and they don't know yet that they're in the middle of it. That's all for tonight. Make sure your doors are locked and try to get some sleep.